morning, my name is Abner Rigos. To what extent do global policies on climate change impact marine biodiversity? Well, based on my research, I have concluded that global policies on climate change negatively impact marine biodiversity. Let's start with the basics. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, is defined as biological diversity in an environment as indicated by the numbers of different species of plants and animals. This biodiversity, as shown in the article How Healthy Are Earth's Oceans by Wynne Perry, ranks top among the impacts certain things have on the health of the oceans, ranked up there with pollution and pH level. Unfortunately, biodiversity is one of the aspects least talked about. As shown in this chart, biodiversity reference intensive and integrated studies of biodiversity represented by the triangles are few and far between compared to other studies in those regions. This demonstrates how there are very few studies on biodiversity, which decreases the biodiversity in each region. This is further reinforced by these graphs. In this graph, squares represent biodiversity conservation, circles represent climate change, and triangles represent biodiversity and climate change as they relate to popular press coverage, Web of Science coverage, World Bank funding, and National Science Foundation funding. As you can see, there are very few triangles and squares compared to the amount of circles in most of these graphs, especially this one. While this is admittedly triangles are still quite prominent, but they're not as prominent as they should be. This decreases biodiversity because there's less biodiversity funding and research, which has a negative impact. Furthermore, in this graph, you can see how climate change is related to biodiversity because it shows how the impact climate change has on certain species in each region. As you can see, about 46% of species from near friend, which is a light yellow, to extinct, which is a black, are either going extinct or are extinct because of climate change. This supports my earlier claim about how climate change impacts biodiversity, which is why biodiversity should have just as much, if not more, research and funding than climate change. But as I said earlier, there is a large amount of research, funding, etc. about climate change. So why is it making such an impact on species? This is because of the current policies and organizations on it, substandards. Currently, you have the Convention on Biological Diversity and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, as demonstrated by the Global Handbook, the Handbook of Global Climate and Environmental Policy, edited by Robert Faulkner. Unfortunately, many of the policies contained within these organizations are narrow-minded, unfocused, and full of loopholes, and are not relevant to all people. This is shown in the peer-reviewed journal, Listen to the Voices of Experience. This negatively impacts biodiversity by not sufficiently representing this important issue because it doesn't include all of the details that slip through the gaps of the narrow focus and the loopholes. On the other hand, many people say that invasive species are destroying biodiversity, not climate change. In fact, E.O. Wilson said, on a global basis, the two great destroyers of biodiversity are, first, habitat destruction, and second, invasion by exotic species. This shows how invasion by exotic species or invasive species are ruining biodiversity in several areas, more than climate change policies. Furthermore, the NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Association article, Invasive and Exotic Marine Species, says that they do play a large role in biodiversity decreasing because of the way that they impact the food web of the marine ecosystems. However, from the evidence previously discussed, one can conclude that climate change policies have a greater and more pronounced effect on marine biodiversity than invasive species. So what are some solutions to this problem? Stricter conservation policies, one that take out the loopholes and are equally relevant to all, is one way. By doing this, we get rid of the loopholes that impact biodiversity in the marine life. Furthermore, a wider focus would, as well as stricter policies, would make sure that the minor details that could make the difference between an increase in biodiversity and a decrease in biodiversity don't slip through. Finally, more research and concentration on the issue will make sure that all people know truly the effect that climate change policies have on marine biodiversity. What are your questions?
All right, I have two questions for you. Listen to this first question because it's confusing. All right. How did you select the strategies you used to gather the information when you were doing your research? I don't want to know the strategies you used. I want to know how you decided to use those strategies.
Okay, so I decided to use the strategies that I did when I was doing my research. From the ways that like I was taught, so I decided to use strategies that were like to search for credible resources. Wait, can you repeat the question?
Mm-hmm. How did you select the strategies you used to gather your information when you were researching?
Oh, I selected my strategies based on which ones would give me the most information and which ones would provide the most relevant and credible information and research for my presentation.
Okay. And what additional questions emerged as you were going through the research?
As I was going through the research, and like for my counterclaim, I talked about invasive species. I thought about how like other things other than climate change policies impact our biodiversity, and I feel like those questions such as those would be really informative and interesting to read more about.
You're done.